The air inside St. Patrick's Cathedral was thick with the scent of 1,000 white roses and old money. Sunlight, filtered through stained glass saints, cast jeweled patterns across the marble floor, illuminating the faces of New York's elite. Crystal chandeliers, heavy as frozen waterfalls, dripped light onto a guest list that read like a who's who of American industry. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a merger of dynasties, a carefully orchestrated performance of wealth and power. Standing at the altar, Ethan Hayes was the very picture of success. His custom tuxedo fit flawlessly, his posture was ramrod straight, and the smile he offered was one he had perfected for magazine covers and shareholder meetings. Yet, beneath the polished exterior, his eyes held a familiar emptiness, a cold, weary distance that no amount of fortune could fill. He was the king of this gilded cage, waiting for a bride who represented his final acquisition. A subtle shift in the heavy oak side door went, almost unnoticed amidst the polite, muffled coughs and rustling silk. A woman named Claire, her face etched with a quiet dignity that couldn't quite hide years of struggle, slipped inside. She held the hands of two small boys, identical twins whose simple, neatly pressed suits were a stark contrast to the bespoke tailoring that surrounded them. Their dark, curly hair and wide, curious brown eyes took in the cavernous space with a silent awe that felt more genuine than anything else in the cathedral. They were the only two people there who weren't performing. Claire guided them to an empty pew in the very back, a small, unassuming island in a sea of influence. She wasn't there to make a scene, but her very presence was a quiet truth that was about to detonate the carefully constructed fiction of the day. As the organist held a soft, expectant chord, Ethan's gaze drifted over the sea of faces, a final cursory scan before his life changed forever. His eyes passed over senators and CEOs, but then they snagged, caught on something in the back. It wasn't Claire he saw at first, but the boys, two small, identical faces looking back at him. It was like staring at a pair of ghosts from his own past, at a photograph of himself from a childhood he'd long since buried. The resemblance was not a gentle echo. It was a physical blow, a gut punch that stole the air from his lungs. The world around him went silent. The officiant's lips moved, but no sound registered. All he could see were his own eyes, his own hair, his own features staring back at him, times two. The carefully built walls of his life crumbled in that single paralyzing instant. "Mr. Hayes, are you all right?" The officiant's voice finally broke through the static in Ethan's mind. The question hung in the air, amplified by the sudden, complete silence of the congregation. Whispers erupted like wildfire, spreading from pew to pew. But Ethan heard none of it. He was a man in a trance, his entire universe, having collapsed to the two small points of light in the back of the church. The bride, the vows, the billion-dollar empire, it all evaporated. He took a step down from the altar, then another, his movements stiff and robotic. He was no longer the groom, the mogul, or the man on the cover of Forbes. He was just a man walking toward a truth he never knew existed, a truth that had just walked in and sat down. It's devastating how one single moment can rewrite your entire existence. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, please consider subscribing. It helps us continue to share them. The cathedral's silence was shattered, replaced by a rising tide of frantic whispers that echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings. The air, once thick with the scent of roses, now felt charged with scandal. Olivia's mother, a woman with a face as hard and polished as a diamond, was the first to react, her sharp gasp cutting through the noise like a shard of glass. She rushed toward the altar, her expression a mask of cold fury, while other guests began pulling out their phones, their faces illuminated by the pale blue light of their screens. In the back pew, Claire instinctively pulled Liam and Noah closer, her body forming a protective shield around them. She had not come for this explosion of chaos. She had only wanted a quiet moment of truth, and now she was at the epicenter of an earthquake that was shaking the foundations of a dynasty. Ethan, deaf to the commotion, finally broke from his trance. He moved with a dreamlike slowness, his legs heavy as he walked down the aisle, away from the life that had just been incinerated behind him. He ignored the outstretched hands and questioning faces, his gaze locked on Claire and the two small boys, who were the source and center of his collapsed world. When he reached their pew, he didn't speak. He simply knelt, bringing himself down to their level, his expensive suit creasing on the cold marble floor. His hand trembled as he reached out, his fingers gently tracing the curve of Liam's cheek. He looked up at Claire, his eyes pleading for an answer he already knew. "We need to go," he said, his voice raspy and unfamiliar to his own ears. "Now, before this becomes something we can't escape." 7 years felt like a lifetime ago. He had been a different man then, hungry and driven, fueled by coffee and the relentless ambition to build something from nothing. Claire was the calm in his storm, a barista at a small, sunlit cafe where he'd spend hours hunched over his laptop. She remembered his order without asking, and always had a kind word, her smile a small beacon in his sleep-deprived haze. Their connection was brief but real, a series of quiet conversations stolen between his coding sessions and her shifts. For a few short weeks, she was the one person who saw past the frantic energy of the entrepreneur and spoke to the man underneath. He had felt a pull toward her that was both grounding and terrifying, a glimpse of a different life he wasn't sure he was ready for. The end came as abruptly as the beginning. A venture capital firm had finally said yes, and Ethan's world exploded into a whirlwind of international flights, board meetings, and 100-hour work weeks. He left the city with a quick goodbye and a promise to call that he fully intended to keep. But the promise was buried under the weight of his rising empire. For him, Claire became a fond but distant memory, a casualty of his single-minded pursuit of success. He never knew that when he walked out of that cafe for the last time, he wasn't just leaving a woman behind. He was leaving a part of himself he would spend the next 7 years trying and failing to find in stock portfolios and corporate acquisitions. He had gained the world, but had unknowingly lost something infinitely more precious. Inside the hushed, leather-scented interior of his limousine, the city streaked by in a blur of indifferent lights. The boys sat between him and Claire, their small bodies rigid with confusion. Ethan couldn't tear his eyes away from them, studying every detail, the way Noah's brow furrowed in concentration as he looked out the window, the way Liam nervously picked at a loose thread on his jacket. It was like watching home movies of a life he'd never lived. The guilt was a physical weight in his chest, making it hard to breathe. He finally turned to Claire, the silence between them stretching for miles. "Why?" He asked, the single word loaded with years of ignorance and regret. "All this time, Claire, why didn't you ever tell me? I would have been there." Claire's gaze didn't waver. There was no anger in her eyes, only a deep, settled weariness. "I tried," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Your old number was disconnected. I sent a letter to your first office, but it came back unopened. Then I saw you on the cover of a magazine, standing in front of a skyscraper with your name on it. You were in a different world, Ethan. What was I supposed to do? Show up with 2 babies and ask for a place in a life that no longer had room for me? I chose to protect them. I didn't want them to feel like an obligation or a secret you had to manage. They deserved more than that. They deserved a mother who wanted them without question, and that's what I gave them. It's heartbreaking to think of how many people face their struggles alone, without a voice. We tell these stories because we believe every voice matters, and if you agree, your subscription gives them a platform. The story of the abandoned wedding went viral within the hour. News vans camped outside Ethan's penthouse, their satellite dishes pointed at his life like accusing fingers. Tabloids ran grainy photos of Claire and the boys, their faces circled in red, alongside glamorous shots of his now ex-fiancée, Olivia. Her family, leveraging their immense media influence, painted Ethan as a monster, a calculated liar who had orchestrated a public humiliation. His business partners grew distant, his friends stopped returning his calls, and the empire he had so meticulously built began to show signs of stress. He was no longer a captain of industry. He was a pariah, isolated in a glass tower of his own making. The external condemnation, however, was nothing compared to the war raging inside him. Ethan Hayes was a man who commanded billion-dollar industries, who could predict market fluctuations and outmaneuver corporate rivals with cold, detached precision. But in the face of two small boys, he was utterly powerless. He felt a terror so profound it eclipsed any professional failure he had ever experienced. How did you hold a small hand without breaking it? What did you say to a child who woke from a bad dream? He was an expert in logistics and strategy, but the simple, terrifying mechanics of fatherhood were a language he didn't understand. The fear of failing them, of being the hollow man the Mai headlines claimed he was the most paralyzing force he had ever known. Claire, meanwhile, found herself in a gilded cage. Ethan had insisted they stay with him for their own safety, but his sprawling, minimalist penthouse felt more like a museum than a home. It was a place of sharp edges, cold marble, and unnerving silence, a stark contrast to their cozy, cluttered apartment. She watched her sons walk timidly through the vast rooms, afraid to touch anything, and her heart ached. Her initial fear of Ethan morphed into a fierce, protective suspicion. Every offer of help, every legal document he presented felt like a strategic move in a takeover bid for her children. The process of establishing paternity became a cold, clinical battleground, with lawyers acting as generals, reducing the most important truth of their lives to clauses and stipulations on a piece of paper. A fragile truce was brokered by a splinter. Noah, ever the explorer, had been running his hand along a wooden sculpture when he yelped in pain. Claire rushed over, but Noah, scared and crying, wouldn't let her near his hand. Ethan approached slowly, kneeling so he was no longer a towering figure. He didn't try to grab Noah's hand. Instead, he started telling a quiet, silly story about a grumpy splinter troll who had gotten lost and just needed help finding his way out. Noah's sobs subsided into hiccups as he listened, captivated. With a gentle touch, Ethan examined the finger and, with a pair of tweezers offered by a silent housekeeper, expertly removed the tiny sliver of wood. For that one brief moment, the lawyers, the media, and the weight of their past vanished. He was just a father comforting his son. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness is what begins to heal the deepest wounds. Stories like this remind us of that power, and by subscribing, you help us continue to find and share them. The fragile peace, however, was short-lived. The unrelenting media attention had consequences. Beyond headlines, the owner of the diner where Claire worked fired her, afraid the constant presence of paparazzi would drive away his regular customers. Suddenly, she was not only emotionally vulnerable, but also financially dependent on the very man she was trying so hard not to need. The boys couldn't go to the local park without being photographed. Liam, the more sensitive of the two, began having nightmares and refused to leave the apartment, his world shrinking to the confines of Ethan's penthouse. The pressure was immense, a slow-burning crisis that threatened to consume them all. Watching Claire's resilience begin to fray, and seeing the genuine fear in Liam's eyes, sparked a profound shift in Ethan. The instinct to control the narrative, to manage the problem, was finally eclipsed by a raw, undeniable need to protect his family. He fired his aggressive PR team and instructed his lawyers to stop their posturing. He started to see Claire not as an obstacle, but as a woman who had single-handedly protected his children with a strength he could only admire. He realized that victory wasn't about winning a custody battle or salvaging his public image. It was about earning the trust of his sons and becoming the father they deserved. The path forward was no longer about reclaiming his old life. It was about having the courage to build an entirely new one from the ashes. The conference room on the 50th floor was a sterile, glass-walled box designed to intimidate. Ethan sat at the head of a massive mahogany table, flanked by lawyers in suits as sharp as their arguments. Across from him, Claire sat with her own counsel, looking small and defiant against the panoramic view of the city. The air was thick with the language of war, parental fitness, financial stability, primary custody. They were carving up a life that wasn't theirs to divide, reducing Liam and Noah to assets in a negotiation. Ethan felt a sickening disconnect, as if he were watching a hostile takeover of a company, not the dismantling of a family. The lead attorney droned on, his words clinical and cruel, painting Claire as an opportunist. Ethan watched her flinch, and for the first time, he felt shame instead of strategic advantage. The final blow came not from a legal argument, but from a single venomous phrase. One of the lawyers mentioned the unsuitability of her previous living conditions, a calculated jab meant to undermine her entire history as a mother. A small sound, a choked sob, escaped from Liam, who had been sitting quietly in a chair by the window. All eyes turned to him. His face was pale, his small body trembling. Before anyone could react, he darted from his chair, a flash of motion toward the heavy office door, and was gone. The sudden, echoing silence was more deafening than all the arguments that had preceded it. Claire's horrified whisper of his name, Liam, was the only sound. Ethan's meticulously controlled world shattered, the blood drained. From his face, as a primal fear, cold and absolute, seized him. The city became a concrete labyrinth, its noise a taunting symphony of indifference. Ethan ran, his lungs burning, the polished leather shoes that had once strode through boardrooms, now pounding against the unforgiving pavement. He shed his suit jacket, tossing it aside without a second thought. All the wealth, all the power that defined him, was rendered meaningless. He couldn't command the city to produce his son. He couldn't leverage a deal for his safety. He was just a man, stripped bare of his empire, shouting a name into the wind. Claire ran beside him, her face a mask of frantic terror, their shared panic forging a bond stronger than any legal document. They were no longer on opposite sides of a table. They were just two parents, united in the singular, desperate search for their child. Hours bled into a terrifying eternity as daylight began to fade, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. That felt like a cruel mockery. They found him in a small, quiet park, tucked away between two towering apartment buildings. Liam was huddled on a bench near a deserted playground, his small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The sight of him, so small and alone, broke something inside Ethan. The dam of his composure, of his carefully constructed identity, finally burst. He approached slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs, and knelt on the damp grass before his son. He didn't speak. Not at first. He just reached out a trembling hand and gently brushed the tears from Liam's cheek, his own eyes blurring with a relief so profound it felt like pain. He pulled Liam into his arms, holding him with a desperate strength, burying his face in his son's soft hair. Over Liam's shoulder, his gaze met Claire's, and in that look, every wall between them crumbled. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, the words raw and broken, meant for all of them. "This is my fault, all of it." He gently set Liam down, but kept his hands on his shoulders, looking from one twin to the other. "I am your father," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had suppressed for a lifetime. "And I'm going to learn how to be the best father in the world, I promise I will never, ever leave you again." It's in these moments of absolute surrender that we find our true strength. If this story resonates with you, subscribing is the most meaningful way to help us share more like it. The lawyers were dismissed the next morning. In the quiet aftermath, with the city's roar a distant hum below the penthouse windows, Ethan and Claire sat at his kitchen table, a place that had previously only seen solitary meals and business calls. There were no documents between them, only two steaming mugs of coffee and a shared, unspoken understanding that the war was over. They talked for hours, not about custody percentages or financial support, but about the boys. Claire spoke of Liam's love for drawing and Noah's fascination with insects, painting a 7-year portrait Ethan had missed. He listened, truly listened, absorbing every detail with a quiet reverence. The legal papers establishing his paternity were signed a week later, not in a cold conference room, but in a small private office, a simple act of paperwork that felt more sacred than any wedding vow he had almost taken. The transformation of Ethan's world was swift and absolute. He sold a significant portion of his company stock, an act that sent shockwaves through the financial world, but felt like the easiest decision he had ever made. With the capital, he established the Claire Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to providing legal, financial, and emotional support to single mothers who, like her, had been left to navigate the world alone. His sterile penthouse, once a monument to his isolation, began to breathe. Colorful drawings were taped to the refrigerator, a half-finished Lego castle took over the living room floor, and the yee echo of his own footsteps was replaced by the sound of the boys' laughter. He was systematically dismantling the gilded cage he had built for himself, and in its place was building a home, one messy, joyful, imperfect piece at a time. He learned the language of fatherhood through daily practice, trading late-night market analyses for bedtime stories and hostile takeover strategies for negotiating which movie to watch on a Friday night. He discovered that Noah had a mischievous grin that was an exact copy of his own, and that Liam, when he felt safe, had a laugh that could fill the largest room. He learned how to apply a bandage with a gentle touch, how to build a pillow fort sturdy enough to withstand an imaginary dragon, and how to be present in a way that board meetings had never required. These small, seemingly insignificant acts were the building blocks of his redemption. He was no longer the man who feared breaking a small hand. He was the man whose hands were now used to push, swings higher, to wipe away tears, and to hold his sons close. 5 years later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, the four of them stood on a hill in a park overlooking the city. Liam and Noah, now 11, chased each other through the fallen leaves, their shouts of joy carried on the wind. Claire stood beside Ethan, a comfortable silence between them, watching the boys. His life was no longer a meticulously curated collection of achievements, but a beautifully chaotic tapestry woven with love, forgiveness, and the profound, humbling reality of being a father. He had lost an empire in the eyes of the world, but had gained a universe within the walls of his own home. True legacies are not carved in stone or listed on the stock exchange. They are written in the hearts of the people we love. Thank you for being here with us, and if you believe in the power of these second chances, please subscribe to help us keep telling these stories.